Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our chapter 20 lecture on terrorism and homeland security. So let's go ahead and just jump right into part 2. So we're going to talk a little bit now about funding terrorism. We've talked a lot about about a lot of different aspects of terrorism, but now we want to figure out, how do terrorists fund their operations? So it takes money for both weapons and general operating expenses to carry out terrorism. Terrorist groups commonly collaborate with organized criminal groups to deal drugs or weapons, and in some cases even people. And the concept of narco-terrorism refers to the use of terrorist attacks to support drug operations, or the use of the drug trade profits to finance terrorism. To finance their operations, terrorist groups often smuggle stolen goods or contraband. They forge documents, they profit from the illegal diamond trade, and they engage in criminal activity to include extortion and protection rackets. And what do they then do with the profits? How do they hide the money or the money trail? Well, this is called hawala. And hawala is basically an informal banking system based on trust and bartering, common throughout the Middle East, and used to transfer billions of dollars every year. There are no tax records or paper trails. And this practice has been used for many years to move terrorist money without a trace of banking records or currency transactions. So hawala allows money launderers to secretly hide and send money out of the country without detection or little detection. And here's a kind of a chart, if you will, that shows you how hawala works. Now, the backbone of the system of hawala is the dealer. And the key ingredient of any hawala deal, of course, is going to be trust. And that's typically how the system works. But I'll let you look at this at your leisure. And I think you'll find it very interesting. So what then is our federal response to terrorism? So on October 19th, 1984, then President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Act to Combat International Terrorism, which established a monetary reward program for information involving terrorist activities. And in 1996, the FBI established the NCTC. And also in 1996, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act was passed, including several other specific measures aimed at terrorism. And this also enhanced the federal government's power to deny visas to individuals belonging to terrorist groups, and simplified the process for deporting individuals convicted of crimes. Now, having announced in 1999 that preventing terrorism was its top priority, the FBI added a new counterterrorism division with 4 subdivisions, if you will: the International Terrorism Section, the Domestic Terrorism Section, the National Infrastructure Protection Center, and the National Domestic Preparedness Office. But all of this was not enough to avert the events that happened on 9/11. It actually took a disaster of this magnitude to make the war on terrorism truly number one, or the number one priority of the United States. And one of the first initiatives was establishing a new federal agency at the cabinet level. So as far as our first response to terrorism goes, just kind of a quick overview. We have the Department of Homeland Security that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We have the FBI, which is the lead agency that responds to acts of domestic terrorism. And we also have FEMA. This is the lead agency for consequence management, meaning after the attack. FEMA also responds after major disasters. Could be hurricanes or the big, the big fires that we have in some areas, or earthquakes. So FEMA, while they do a lot of preparatory training and getting everybody set for a response, if you will, a lot of what they do is consequence or after the fact management. So on October 8th, 2001, then President George W. Bush signed Executive Order 13228, establishing the Department of Homeland Security. And Homeland Security it's a combination of law enforcement, disaster, immigration, and terrorism. And there are 5 core objectives that fall under the Department of Homeland Security. So it's to prevent terrorism and enhance security, to secure and manage our borders, to enforce and administer our immigration laws, to safeguard and secure cyberspace, and finally to strengthen national preparedness. That's kind of the FEMA component, if you will, and resilience, meaning the ability to bounce back, if you will. And this is what the Department of Homeland Security looks like. So they've combined several agencies into making one larger agency that is now titled the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And while now, if you want to know a little bit more about this particular, the issue of Homeland Security and terrorism, I'll give you a plug for AJ117, which is a course that we teach at MSJC, and actually I teach it both in the class and online. It's Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. And you'll learn more about these agencies that I just want to point out at the bottom. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here, but you're going to work with and understand probably more of the responding agencies like U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, the Coast Guard, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement, the U.S. Secret Service, and then Transportation Security Administration. So if you want to know more about these agencies and how they fit into terrorism and homeland security, I would highly suggest AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. So now let's talk a little bit about, still under the federal response to terrorism, talk about the USA Patriot Act. A little bit controversial. On October 26th, 2001, then President George W. Bush signed into law the United and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. God, that's a lot of words. Or the USA Patriot Act. And just kind of an overview of what the Patriot Act does or is. It helps law enforcement by, we use the tools that are already available. This act helps facilitate information sharing. It updates some of the laws. It reflects new technologies and new threats. And it also increases the penalties for those who commit or support terrorist crimes. So how does it kind of do that? So let's get a little more detailed. So more specifically, this act gives police or law enforcement agencies unprecedented ability to search, seize, detain, and eavesdrop or listen in their pursuit of terrorists or terrorism. And the law really did expand the FBI's wiretapping and electronic surveillance authority, and also allowed nationwide jurisdiction for search warrants and electronic surveillance. So it really enhanced our capabilities. Now, the USA Patriot Act was only originally meant for a certain period of time. So it would actually sunset, meaning it would fade out if it wasn't renewed. So President Obama signed a 4-year extension or sunset extension of the USA Patriot Act on May 26, 2011. And it also included 3 key provisions. It allowed for roving wiretaps. It allowed for surveillance of lone wolf terror suspects, because we started to see that these were becoming very common. And it also allowed for searches of business records. And then remember how I told you that this Patriot Act would sunset? Well, now we're going to talk about the USA Freedom Act, because as the USA Patriot Act was going to expire, if you will, or sunset, then came about the USA Freedom Act. So enacted on June 2nd, 2015, basically the USA Freedom Act restored in modified form several provisions of the original USA Patriot Act. Now, it did impose some limitations on bulk collection of telecommunications metadata, but for the most part, it still allows law enforcement to use a lot of the things that I spoke about in their pursuit of terrorists. So hopefully that's kind of a little overview. And here I have a link to both the Patriot Act and the USA Freedom Act if you want to learn a little bit more. And another response to terrorism would be using what we call fusion centers. So an initiative aimed at promoting and facilitating information and intelligence sharing among both federal and local law enforcement agencies is the development of fusion centers throughout the entire United States. And a fusion center, by definition, is a collaborative effort of 2 or more agencies that provide resources, expertise, and information to the center with the overriding goal of maximizing their ability to detect, prevent, investigate, and respond to criminal and terrorist activities. The term fusion conveys the concept that the collaborative effort goes beyond simply establishing information and intelligence centers or creating a computer network, and instead refers to the overarching process of managing the flow of information and intelligence across all levels and all sectors of the government and the private sector. So fusion centers commonly take all crimes or all hazards approach, as well as the inclusion of multidisciplinary and non-law enforcement partners in their overall process. So it's kind of a cool thing when you talk about these fusion centers. So let's talk now about what we call hometown security and homeland security, and look at 5 principles. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, has defined 5 key principles that should form the basis for a national homeland security strategy. So first would be the fact that all terrorism is local. And next would be that prevention is paramount. Homeland security is homeland or hometown security. It also includes coordinating strategies nationally, not just federally. And it also encompasses bottom-up engineering, meaning it's important, which involves state, tribal, and local public safety communities in a non-competitive collaboration. Because the nearly 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies in the United States, they employ roughly, let's say about 765,000 sworn officers who patrol the city streets daily, and they know their communities intimately. Thus, it makes sense that the first line of defense against terrorism is going to be the patrol officer in the field, right? And any law enforcement officer can potentially come into contact with a terrorist at any time, whether investigating a unrelated crime, conducting routine duties, or backing up another officer. And many of the 9/11 hijackers had prior contact with law enforcement officers in various parts of the country. I bet you probably didn't know that. So we really have to understand that hometown security is, in fact, homeland security. So how do we now investigate these possible terrorists? So investigating possible terrorist activities is facilitated by the fact that terrorists also engage in other types of criminal activity, specifically, of course, to finance terrorism. And a growing body of literature supports the hypothesis of a crime-terror nexus, especially as a result of the post-9/11 alarm on terrorism financing. So one way to address terrorism is to modify laws that deal with white-collar crimes or those traditionally non-violent crimes involving some sort of fraud to achieve financial gain. And these crimes would include credit card fraud or insurance fraud, identity theft, money laundering, immigration fraud, and tax evasion. And this approach rests on the assumption that terrorist activities are going to require funding for weapons and for training and for travel. And it kind of makes sense, right? That they're going to have to be able to finance some of this. And another major challenge in the war on terrorism is ensuring that individual officers remain vigilant and cognizant of their critical role in homeland security. For example, law enforcement officers should be on the watch during traffic stops and other contacts for certain logos or even words that suggest membership in a terrorist group or financial or general, supporting of them. And these types of emblems may be noticed on things like jewelry or documents or posters or other types of materials. Law enforcement officers should also be aware of terrorist indicators, such as negative rhetoric, excessive physical training, anti-American literature, or disregard for U.S. laws. And terrorists and their supporters tend to act alike because many have trained in the same camps, and they, subsequently they share the same negative beliefs. Also, thinking about those soft targets, those large targets, but maybe soft targets that might be valuable or vulnerable to an attack. So a soft target are those that are left relatively unguarded and are becoming more popular. So, an example could be places that are crowded. So let me give you one: Disneyland. Now, while there is security, etc., it's not as hardened of a target as, let's say, an airport or even maybe a football stadium or something like that. Does that kind of make sense? So hard targets are those that would be more difficult or vulnerable to an attack. And a soft target are those that might have a lot of individuals there, but they are left relatively unguarded. They just have kind of the basics. And these types of targets are becoming popular. So knowing where the hard targets and the soft targets are in your city would be extremely important. So now let's take a look at the typical stages in a terrorist attack. So terrorist attacks typically have 3 stages. The first stage is research, including surveillance, stakeouts, and local inquiries. Local law enforcement officers can best serve the counterterrorism effort at this stage because the terrorists are out in public. They're watching us. They're studying our habits. They're discovering our vulnerabilities and reporting back to their handlers with prospective targeting data to begin that planning stage. Now, interestingly, a study of a terrorist attack of the sites found that nearly half of the attackers lived within a 30-mile radius of their selected target. So, kind of an interesting thing, right? And the second stage is planning, usually conducted behind closed door. The average planning cycle for international terrorists is about 92 days compared with 14 days for, let's say, environmental terrorists. And then the third stage is the execution, the actual attack and possible escape. And often these attacks are carried out by a sleeper cell. And we've talked about what those folks are: a group of terrorists who blend into the community. So again, a 3-tiered model of an Al-Qaeda attack by sleeper cells would be attacking in conjunction with the group's leaders, attacking on their own, or individuals attacking with support from small cells. But what I read to you before were the typical stages, if you will. And again, and I have them on a separate slide so you can look at them. So stage 1, just to kind of review, it's the research, surveillance, and stakeout stage. It's because they're out in public. They're watching what we do. They're looking at our habits, discovering vulnerabilities. So this is where us in law enforcement, we can actually maybe notice them out in public and take note, or maybe do some type of stop of the individuals and talk to them and gather our own information, etc. Stage 2 is the planning stage, usually conducted behind closed doors. So again, we're not going to really see this part. And then stage 3 is the execution or carrying out. and this is the actual attack. And again, these attacks are typically carried out by a sleeper cell, which we already have defined. So also part of the investigation stage or investigating terrorism includes gathering intelligence and really understanding the difference between intelligence and information. So when you talk about the intelligence cycle, let's take a look at that. So this cycle begins with knowing the intelligence requirements that are needed for an investigation. What do investigators need to know to be effectively safeguarding the nation? And these requirements are usually established by the director of the National Intelligence Center under the guidance of the President and the National and Homeland Security advisors. So the second step would be planning and direction. And this is a function of the FBI and is led by the Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch. And the third step is collecting raw information from local, state, and federal investigations. And such information may come from interviews, technical and physical surveillance, searches, human source operations, and liaison relationships. The fourth is processing and exploiting. And this is the raw information into a form usable by analysts. Fifth is analysis and production, which converts the raw information into intelligence. And then the final step is dissemination of the intelligence to consumers who make decisions based on the intelligence. And these decisions may levy further requirements, thus continuing the intelligence cycle. So if you look at the intelligence cycle, and it seems kind of complicated, but it's really not. But again, it starts at, again, we looked at the actual host cycle. Here's an example of the intelligence cycle. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So what are some keys to combating terrorism, and also talking about collaboration and partnerships? And we've talked about partnerships. We always talk about partnerships. What are some crucial collaborations? Well, the importance of partnerships between law enforcement agencies at all levels cannot be overstated as it applies to the war on terrorism. The issue of effective partnerships among local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies has deserved attention for at least half a century, and now it really demands attention. Communication should be the number one priority in any terrorist preparedness plan, and is number one in collaboration among local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. An extremely valuable resource for investigators is the Regional Information Sharing System. They call it RIS. And this is a program which will assist state and local agencies by sharing information and intelligence regarding terrorism. So again, the number one priority here is, in fact, communication. So some initiatives to help assist in the fight of terrorism. Well, there are several initiatives have been undertaken to help in the fight against terrorism. And one such initiative is the production or producing of the FBI Intelligence Bulletin. This is a weekly online publication containing information related to terrorism in the United States. Now, recipients include duly authorized members of all law enforcement agencies who have registered with a law enforcement network. Another initiative that indirectly supports the fight against terrorism is the passage of the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act of 2004, which gives qualified active duty as well as qualified retired police officers the right to carry their firearm concealed in all 50 states. So it's concealed carry from a retired law enforcement point of view. And some other initiatives include increased security, of course, at our borders. So these are just some common initiatives that have come about to help assist in the fight against terrorism. And there's also the National Incident Management System. So in October 2003, the Department of Homeland Security created the Initial Response Plan. And this was an interim plan designed to help develop a unified approach, meaning getting all of the agencies on the same page, to domestic incident management across the nation. On March 1st, 2004, then Secretary Ridge announced the approval of the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, the country's first standardized management approach, basically unifying federal, state, and local governments for incident response. So NIMS establishes standardized incident management processes, protocols, and procedures that all responders, federal, state, tribal, and local, are going to use in order to coordinate and conduct response actions. Because we never had that before. All the different agencies kind of did their own thing. Now we have all of the groups working together. Another initiative that was formed to assist in the fight of terrorism would be the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. So the FBI has Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or they call them the JTTFs, in 104 cities throughout the country, including at least one in each of its 56 field offices. And the JTTFs are the nation's front line on terrorism, and they consist of small groups of highly trained, locally based investigators, analysts, linguistics, SWAT experts, and other, meaning like SWAT team tactical experts, and other specialists from dozens of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And in a JTTF, all investigators, whether FBI agents, other federal officers, or state or local officers, are equal partners. Every investigator is assigned a substantive amount of cases and work, and they follow the basic FBI protocols. So these are highly trained groups that you can liaison with if you have something that you need to deal with in your particular city, whether it's training or you suspect any type of terrorist activity. And we would be remiss in this particular chapter if we didn't talk about the media and the war on terrorism, because the media has a lot to do with a lot of things. So terrorism really is futile without publicity, because remember, part of the goal of terrorism is the fear factor, right? And we've discussed that. Well, if they don't get the media coverage that they want, then maybe the outcome won't be what, they're not going to get the outcome they want. So we know that media generates a lot of publicity, and it also generates what we call the contagion effect. And this basically means that coverage of terrorism inspires more terrorism because it's contagious. Now, the symbiotic relationship basically means that the terrorists need the media. Now, the media don't need the terrorists, but they need the story. Does that make sense? Just like there's a symbiotic relationship between law enforcement and the media. The media needs the story, the crime, the pictures, the stuff. Law enforcement also needs the media to help them a lot of times with missing children, with missing adults, with trying to track down suspects. So they have that dependent symbiotic relationship. So that's defining what symbiotic means. The contagion effect is the fact that coverage of terrorism tends to inspire more, thus the phrase contagious. And I threw up just a couple of press conference pictures, because a lot of this stuff, just like major crimes, shootings, etc., major disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, terrorism, all of this stuff tends to make the news. And then finally, let's wrap up talking about the concern for civil rights. So concerns related to the war on terrorism. So two pressing concerns related to the war on terrorism are that civil liberties may be jeopardized and that people of Middle Eastern descent may be discriminated against or become victims of hate crimes. You see, civil libertarians, they really are, and I am too, and we should be all together as law enforcement, we're concerned that the valued American freedoms will be sacrificed or possibly could be sacrificed in the interest of national safety. So we want to make sure that we adhere to the guiding principles of the Department of Homeland Security. And their number one principle is to protect civil rights and civil liberties. So, other concerns would be that some Americans may retaliate against innocent individuals from, that are of Middle Eastern descent, and many of whom were either born here in the U.S. or are naturalized citizens. So we basically have identified 4 significant obstacles to improved relations between police and those of our Arab American communities. And one would be distrust between Arab American communities and law enforcement. Another would be the lack of cultural awareness among law enforcement officers. Perhaps even language barriers. And then finally, concerns about immigration status and fear of deportation. Community policing efforts can do much to overcome these types of obstacles. So some of the guidelines as it relates to community policing to perhaps help mitigate some of these issues as it relates to the concern for civil rights, etc. So establish a liaison with the Department of Homeland Security. Formulate a policy statement on community policing and Homeland Security, how your organization is going to deal with terrorism and investigative efforts. Emphasize the importance of reporting information. Make sure that your community knows that you want them to report information. And then finally, do not make assumptions about guilt. So in summary, the threat of terrorism has become a reality in America. And the FBI, remember, classifies terrorist acts as either domestic or international. The Department of Homeland Security was established as a result of 9/11. The USA Patriot Act significantly improved the nation's counterterrorism efforts. And remember, the USA Patriot Act was extended a couple of times because it had those sunset clauses, and then it was finally replaced by the USA Freedom Act. And then finally, a difficult challenge is finding a balance between enhancing security and, of course, the need to maintain freedom. So that's going to conclude our Part 2 lecture on Chapter 20, Terrorism and Homeland Security. Until next time.